By the start of the 18th century, England had been colonizing North America for over a century. During that time, the Europeans annexed more and more land, brought disease, and irreversibly changed the landscape of the continent. Colonization of the Americas was meant to enrich European kingdoms. Gold and silver mines were rare and quickly exhausted by the Spanish, so cash crops became the main source of economic growth in the English colonies. To keep production costs low and profits high, labor had to be as cheap as possible. As we discussed in our previous episodes, indentured servitude was initially a common means for this. But as more planters paid out land and resources to those who had completed their indentured servitude, it was practiced less. Colonists then began to enslave natives who lost battles over territory in order to increase their labor force. Keeping the indigenous people enslaved proved difficult, however, since they had a home field advantage. Escape was a common occurrence. Additionally, the native population started to shrink rapidly due to European diseases and constant battles and skirmishes with the colonists. It was in 1619, while looking for a new, cheaper labor force, that a group of enslaved Africans were brought through the Chesapeake Bay. During the Atlantic slave trade, Africans were brought through the Middle Passage, which was the route across the Atlantic Ocean from West Africa to the colonies. At least half a dozen different European countries participated in the buying and selling of African people. The enslaved resisted in a variety of ways, like slowing their work pace, feigning illness, or all-out rebellion. But slavery wasn't abolished in the US until 1865. So today we're examining how enslavers stayed in power for over 2 centuries, as well as how the enslaved resisted that power. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, US History to 1865. Enslaved Africans began resisting their enslavement almost immediately. As Dr. Michael Creighton put it, slaves naturally resisted their enslavement because slavery was fundamentally unnatural. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most brutal institutions in all of human history. While there were and always will be people from every walk of life that opposed slavery, the slave trade persisted. Why? Well, for one thing, the profits being reaped from the sweat of enslaved people were so high, those who profited from it had no intention of letting basic morals end the good thing they had going. So their practices became policy. Not only was slavery institutionalized, but it was justified by European ideas of racial hierarchy. The demand for more labor could not be met by the white indentured servant population, and the transatlantic slave trade was accelerated by the dehumanization of Africans as the other. Colonizers came to believe that Black Africans were built for excruciating labor, while such work was beneath them. These same ideals led to centuries of systematic racism in the United States. It became more widespread and codified in law as time went on. In 1662, Virginia enacted a law stating that the status of the mother would determine whether or not any Black child would spend their life enslaved, with no regards as to the status of the father. This especially led to Black women enduring a double prejudice and untold atrocities throughout U.S. history. And as we said, indigenous peoples did not make ideal slaves. Many of them were dying from European diseases, and the ones that could escape usually found a way to do it. We should also add that this history is understudied largely because enslaved Native Americans were working more under the table. There were no paper trails for Native enslavement, but we have large amounts of legal documentation for the transport and sale of enslaved Africans. In any case, once the decision was made to import enslaved Africans instead, Europeans used all sorts of justifications for doing so, including converting them to Christianity. As a result, roughly 20 million Native Americans died within the first century of the European invasion of the Americas. And roughly 12.5 million Africans were stolen from their homes and forced into labor in the New World. The second group became chattel slaves, meaning they were essentially treated as livestock. Babies would often be ripped from their mother's arms and sold off, sometimes never to see their family again. The enslaved were brought to all corners of the New World. Those that landed in the Caribbean found themselves working on sugar plantations. This was the most ferocious of all forced labor. The intensive work required to produce sugar in the 17th century was extremely dangerous, and most workers didn't live even 10 years once they arrived. In response to this situation, the white planters in the Caribbean transported a never-ending stream of African laborers. A person would be worked to death and then immediately replaced. Even though the enslaved population was in this constant state of death and replacement, enslavers were bringing so many people to the Caribbean that by the early 18th century, enslaved Africans in Barbados outnumbered Europeans 3-1. Outside of the sugar plantations on the North American mainland, the enslaved were less likely to be worked to death, but they still received harsh punishments for even the slightest offenses. This led to an outbreak of escape attempts, which in turn led to more slave laws, including a series of legislation specifically for fugitives. Along with escape attempts, rebellions erupted in multiple colonies. One of the most influential and certainly one of the bloodiest rebellions in pre-Revolution America was the Stono Rebellion, led by an enslaved man named Cato, aka Jemmy. The rebellion was timed to take place just before a new law was to be passed in South Carolina, allowing all white men to carry firearms to church. On Sundays, the enslaved had just a bit more freedom because their masters and overseers would be in church. This led politicians, many of whom were enslavers themselves, to prepare for increased escape or rebellion attempts on Sundays. Aware of the upcoming law, Cato saw an opportunity to beat enslavers at their own game. On September 9th, 1739, Cato convinced about 20 other enslaved Africans to join him in an escape attempt with plans to make their way to St. Augustine, Florida. The Spanish, hoping to destabilize the British colonies, had promised freedom to any enslaved people escaping from those colonies. They enacted their plan the following day, first raiding a gun shop and killing 2 people inside. From there, they made their way south, destroying every plantation they came across, freeing any fellow enslaved people they found. By the end, there were roughly 80 freed people cutting a path of violent justice on their way to Florida. They used drums and music as coded messages to fellow enslaved people and shouted liberty as they marched. Unfortunately for Cato and his followers, the rebellion was short-lived. A militia was quickly formed in order to combat the rebel enslaved people. After destroying 7 plantations and marching 15 miles from Charleston, the rebels were met by the militia and a battle ensued. Dozens of the runaways were killed, as were 20 members of the militia. Most of the remaining enslaved were eventually captured and executed. The rebellion resulted in even more restrictive slave codes being passed. However, enslavers were also urged to treat enslaved people better, hoping this would prevent the desire for rebellion or escape. As time went on, the free labor obtained by enslaving Africans became the backbone of the American economy. Even colonists who didn't enslave would still profit from the forced labor by conducting business with planters. Cotton, tobacco, and eventually rice all became staples of the colonial economy. Plantations stretched for miles from Georgia to Maryland. Without the labor of enslaved Africans, the American economy would likely look very different. From their initial capture, to their transport to shore, to auctions and plantation labor, the enslaved suffered many atrocities while building the American colonies. The role of American colonial history in the Atlantic slave trade is especially brutal, but it is also inseparable from the rise of the American colonies. The nation's developing economy relied on the profits from enslavers, and the slave trade itself was so profitable that those in charge could pay lawmakers to protect them for centuries. While much of this history is incomplete, historians continue to work to recover what is still unknown about this time in history. We hope you'll continue to join us as we talk about the labor that built America in our upcoming episodes. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU at the links in the description. See you next time.